Hi, so my technique is called visual feedback with electropalatography, and this was introduced by Fiona Gibbon, who has done a lot of research with it. She's a speech and language professor at a college, and she specifically wanted to study how this technique um, influenced and helped those with speech and motor disorders. So, as we're looking at this, you can see that the target population for visual feedback with electropalatography is going to be, like I said, those with speech production disorders. And then this includes those with like cleft palate speech, so they have a fistula or other physical impairment that makes it difficult for them to produce speech correctly. This can be used with kids 8 years and up with articulation disorders and that are struggling to produce certain sounds. And then glossectomy, which is basically when, because of cancer or some other abnormality of your tongue, they end up removing part of your tongue, and then as a result, it can be difficult to produce all of those speech sounds. And then Down syndrome as well. And Down syndrome is interesting because sometimes their tongue size is abnormally large, and so they will struggle and be hard to understand. So this therapy has been used with them with lots of success as well. And then hearing impairment, a lot of times it can be difficult if you can't hear yourself to produce the sounds correctly so that other people can understand you, but this gives you the visual feedback so that way those with hearing impairment can still produce the sounds correctly. And it's a very unique way and very helpful for them. And then autism as well, they can have some issues with intelligibility and producing speech sounds correctly, so they're part of the target population as well for electropalatography. And then kind of the philosophy of this approach is that it builds on the interactionist theory. And what I mean by that is that, well, if you go back in time and you think about when we talked about all those different theories, the interactionist theory was talking about how a child basically goes around and they're like a little scientist and they're experimenting all the time with what works in their environment and how the environment responds to them, and then they change the way they produce things or the way they understand things based on this interaction between them and the environment. So basically this provides them with a visual to see their incorrect productions, and it's actually had lots of research, especially with those with Down syndrome and those with articulation and cleft palate speech, that they're more successful and they're able to produce more of the sounds they want to produce and have like a greater accuracy when they receive this visual feedback from the electropalatography. And then it's basically includes all the sounds where your tongue is contacting your palate at some point, like T and D, S and Z, the G sound, N, L, and R. So all of those sounds. And basically the child or adult, is interacting with this technology, and then based on the feedback that the technology gives them, they are able to correct themselves and have more accurate productions. The procedures. So to start, I don't know how many of you have ever gone to like an orthodontist to get braces, but they would have you, basically it's like a retainer full of this like sticky goo stuff, and you would put your mouth into the retainer of the sticky goo, and then that goo would create an exact copy of your mouth and your teeth arrangement and everything. So that's like the first step for electropalatography, is that they create this palette that is your palette, and then they do all kinds of shaping with it to cut it down to make it exactly so it fits in your mouth perfectly. And then on this palette, actually, I'm going to show you guys a picture really quickly. Yeah, so this is kind of what it looks like here. They create this palette from that indentation you made with that sticky goo, and then it has all sorts of sensors on it, like tons of them, like 110 or more. Sensors will be on this palette that they create just for you. And then once they create this palette, then it's connected up to a processor, which that processor is going to record all of your tongue movements in your mouth and where your tongue is hitting those sensors on that palette they created for you. And then it's going to send that information to a dual screen software, which I'm going to go back to my pictures here really quickly. So that's going to look like this, where, as you can see, one of the pictures on the screen is what that person is producing, what their tongue is doing, and then the other one is the correct production, or the model, what they want to produce. So you can see they have like the LS blend here, and what that should look like in the purple, and then they have like the S production and what that should look like in the purple, and then all these other ones are what the client was producing that weren't quite correct. But yeah, you want to try to match basically what you're producing and what you see on the screen to what you want to be producing. And that's how that whole procedure works. It can take a while because a lot of times you'll need like a professional dentist or orthodontist or something to create that impression. And like I said, yeah, it has to be super individualized to the person. You can't just throw on any old palette and sensor and expect it to work, because everybody's mouths are different sizes. But yeah, that's sort of how that works with the procedure. So yeah, it can also be kind of expensive to do this approach, which is why it's super, super helpful and the research backs it up, but not a lot of people are using it right now because of how expensive it can be to buy the software and to get the palette created properly and the time that it takes. So that's kind of one of the downsides of this method, I guess. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is all the different softwares that are available. So there's quite a few, but the main ones that I found are the Smart Palette, the LinguaGraph, and WinEPG. And then, like I said, there's pretty much just three main parts to all of these softwares, but I'll show you kind of two of them. So yeah, like I said, you have the mouthpiece, as you can see here, which is connected to a processor, which is connected to the actual software that reads and interprets and shows the client what they're doing. And this is what the Smart Palette one looks like. And then the LinguaGraph is really similar, where it's connected up to their mouth, which goes to the unit or the processor, which goes to the computer display. And then the WinEPG is also super similar. So that's just kind of how this method works, but it's super awesome because instead of having the SLP have to be analyzing what the person is doing all the time, which can be really hard, they can see exactly where their tongue is in their mouth, and you can give them more specific feedback, which is really helpful. And they can practice and correct themselves as well. So that's kind of the benefit with this technique. Hi, so these are my references that I used for my presentation. Yep, and that's it for me.